Exodus. I am on staff at the Atlanta History Center. Today is Thursday, October the 30th, 2003. We are doing a Veterans History Project interview with a civilian, Frances Ann McKibben. Frances, would you repeat your name and give me your birth date and place?
I'm Frances McKibben. I was born at Georgia Baptist Hospital in Atlanta on August the 20th, 1926.
August of 26. All right, thank you. Were you raised in Atlanta?
Yes, I'm the fifth generation who's lived in Atlanta.
Tell me something about your ancestors then. Who first came to Atlanta?
My grandmother's great uncles came down in the land grant after the Cherokee Indians were driven out and staked out a good bit of land over in what is now known as Martin Luther King Drive in that area.
Do you know their names?
Do I know my ancestors' names? Most of them, yes.
What were their names?
Coursey, there was their last name. My great-great-grandfather was named Lloyd, and his son was named Lloyd Samuel. My great-great-grandmother was named Mary, and her daughter was named Eliza. My grandmother was the only daughter of 9 children. She had 8 brothers. And
what was her name?
Coursey, and she married my grandfather.
Give me her full name.
Nellie Elizabeth Coursey.
Nellie Elizabeth Coursey.
And she married my grandfather when she was 21 years old, and his name was William Theophilus Spear.
And where was he from?
He came from Alabama by way of Lafayette. They were married in Atlanta. He came to live with his aunt in Atlanta at that time, and I don't remember what her name was. But strangely enough, I found out that they're all buried. I knew my grandmother and grandfather were buried at Hollywood Cemetery, but also all of my grandfather's people are buried at Hollywood.
And for 100 years from now, if someone says, I wonder where Hollywood Cemetery is, tell us where that is.
You know, I can take you, but I can't tell you. It's over around the Perry Homes area. If you know where Perry Homes is, it's in that general area.
Is that southwest or southeast Atlanta?
It would be northeast.
Northeast.
And they were buried there. And as I said, I did not know his people were buried there also. My grandmother's people are buried in the old Coursey Cemetery off of North Avenue and Simpson Road. And the cemetery is still kept by the members of the family so that we can go out there if we are brave enough to do so. But my grandmother and grandfather had 4 children, 3 girls and a boy that lived. She delivered 3 children who were stillborn. And I grew up in Grove Park, where my mother grew up and where my grandmother and grandfather had settled.
And where is Grove Park?
Grove Park is is on Bankhead Avenue going out toward Hollywood Road.
Okay.
And it was founded by Dr. Grove, who wanted people to set up just a regular neighborhood, and it was a most marvelous place in the world to grow up.
Tell me why.
Everybody knew everybody else, and they looked after, all the adults looked after all the children, and you could walk to school, and if something happened...
What was the name of the school?
Lena Cox was the elementary school that I went to. Then I went to West Fulton High School, and then from there I went to LaGrange College. But it was just a wonderful experience growing up, sitting out on the curb at night and listening to people talk back and forth across the street.
Tell me what the houses look like, the house that you grew up in.
The house that I grew up in had, and I have to stop and think, had 8 rooms, and it was what they call a shotgun house because it had a hall going straight down the middle, and all the rooms went off from the hall. And my father died when I was 2 years old, so I don't remember too much about that. But my mother and I went back to live with my grandparents, and I lived with my grandmother until I got married. And
So when you were born, were your parents living in this Grove Park area?
Yes, they were.
Then when you moved in with your grandmother,
they were still living in the Grove
Park.
Park. Yes. Daddy died of a massive heart attack, and so I unfortunately am one of the ones that has inherited all the bad things on both sides of the family. But my uncle Frank was a football player at Georgia Tech, and he went to the Rose Bowl twice, and he was supposed to go the third time.
And what was his name?
Frank Spear.
Frank Spear.
Mm-hmm. And the third time they found out he was married, and they wouldn't let him go. He'd gotten married secretly, and my mother and grandmother and grandfather didn't know this, and they were very upset that he was not allowed to go. But anyway, it was just a wonderful atmosphere to grow up. All the teachers knew you. Everybody in the neighborhood knew you. The church that we attended is the one that my grandmother and her brothers founded.
The name of the church?
Bethany Methodist Church on Elizabeth Place. And it burned in 1936, I think, 36 or 37. And they had fish fries, carry-out dinners, ice cream socials, anything that they could to raise money, and they rebuilt the church. Because at that time, so many people had gone through the Depression, and there just wasn't any money. My grandfather lost his business in the Depression. And
what business was he?
He was in what they call the radiator business. He serviced airplanes and the huge Mack trucks. And he had a good business and made a good living, but it just, everything vanished. And as a result of that, my grandmother always said when he lost his business it killed him, because he only lived 3 years after the Depression, after he lost his business. And he died in 1936. And I don't remember too much about that. I was only 10 years old. But I remember, and this was done all the time at that age, they brought the caskets home, and they left them in the living room, and someone would sit, not necessarily someone in the family, but someone would sit up all night with them until the next morning, and then somebody would change, and then they would have the funeral, and that would be it. But I remember so well seeing that casket and hanging back because I didn't want to go in, and luckily they did not force me to go in. So many of them were forced to go in and kiss the dead one, and I would have died. But my mother said, if you don't want to, you don't have to, and I didn't.
Do you remember any other of the sort of mourning customs?
Yes, the women wore black, not just to the funeral, but my mother wore black for a year. In the summertime, she wore white, but in the wintertime, she wore all black. My grandmother wore black almost the rest of her life after that, and particularly after my uncle died. She just said that it was, she had lost both of the men in her family, and she didn't like it, but she wore black. Mm-hmm. And everybody brought food in. I remember that so well because the tables in the dining room and in the kitchen were just loaded with food. And people would come and sit with my grandmother and talk to her. And they did to my mother and her sisters and her brother. Mm-hmm. But the thing that I remember most of all was Mama woke my mother up and said, something's wrong with Papa. And Mother and Frances, my youngest aunt, got up out of the bed. And of course I got up too, not knowing what was going on. And there was a doctor who lived across in the park area. And we went out the door, running up Eleanor Place, hollering, Dr. Childs, please come help, Papa's dying. Well, that was what my mother was saying. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, my grandmother had called my uncle, and he came up immediately. And what really, that running up the street calling for Dr. Childs, and also my uncle coming in, and I was standing in the doorway of my grandmother's bedroom, and Dr. Childs had already been there and pronounced him dead, and we were just waiting for the funeral home. And he had pulled the sheet over my grandfather's face, and my uncle went in and took the sheet off of his face, and then just stood there and cried, because this was so unexpected. We didn't expect Papa to die, because he too, like my father, died with a massive heart attack. And so when I go to doctors today and they say, what is your family medical history? I say, heart attacks on both sides. But
my family is the same way.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
But it was it was a wonderful neighborhood to grow up in. You knew everybody knew you.
You said that you would sit at night and sort of talk up and down.
Up and down, and the children would play.
What games would the children play?
Hopscotch, hide and go seek, catching lightning buds particularly, and let me see, what else did we play? good gracious, I can't remember that far back what we did play.
It's all right.
But you just grew up knowing everybody and everybody knowing you. Mm-hmm. And my grandmother had a quilting bee that she went to every Wednesday morning and stayed until usually 3 o'clock when we would come home from school. And she would go down to my cousin Etta's house at a Hubbard. And we were always told, come home to Cousin Etta. Don't go to the house. Come home there. And you would walk in, and Lillian, I have never seen as much food for 6 ladies in my life. But they would have this table in Cousin Etta's dining room, and they had put cheesecloth over it, and there was every kind of food you can imagine on that table. And they would just...
How often did they meet?
Once a week.
Once a week.
Once a week. And I had 2 quilts that my grandmother did, and my cousin talked me out of them, and I will never forgive him for that. But he has them, and they're well taken care of, so it doesn't really matter. But it was just a wonderful time to grow up.
What about moving into the high school years? Were you still living in your grandmother's house?
No. Mother sold the house because it needed a lot of repair, and she said it wasn't worth it. It was an old house as it was because Papa had built it when he and my grandmother married, so it was over 50 years old. And she built a house on Elizabeth Place. She worked for the Line Oak Flooring Lumber Company, so she was able to get all of the material at wholesale. And that house had, four bedrooms and 2 baths, a living room, dining room, kitchen, and eating area, and no den. The living room was your den at that time. And it wasn't so far to walk to either elementary school from where we did live to high school. And so I enrolled in West Fulton when I graduated from Lena Cox.
So 4 bedrooms. Mm-hmm. Who was living in the house?
My aunt, or nobody when we first moved in, but it was just my mother and my grandmother and me, so we each had our own bedrooms. But then my aunt's husband went into the Marine Corps, and she came back to live with us with her young baby. So she took over the 2 bedrooms upstairs, and Mother had made sort of a little storage room upstairs, and she made that into a kitchen for Francis. And it was sort of crowded, but she needed someplace to go with my uncle in service. So she lived with us, and I guess how long? They lived with us until the oldest child, say Michael, 7 years difference between. Michael must have been 2 and Carlton must have been 9.
When they moved in?
When they moved out.
Oh,
moved out. And they had to work and save money to buy a house because money wasn't very plentiful then, as it was in most cases for young men coming back from the service. So they stayed there, and then they bought their own house.
Was it Aunt Frances?
Mm-hmm. It was her husband.
With one child?
Moved in with one child. He came home.
2.
And
was this during World War II?
Yes, this was during World War II. She lived there. And after Benny was discharged from the service, they still lived there until he was settled in his job. And Michael, let me see, Carlton was born in 1942. He was 9, so they lived there until the early 1950s, and then they moved out. And then Mother took over the whole house again. And
well, if it was 4 bedrooms and she had 2 bedrooms upstairs,
and 2 down.
Were downstairs.
Mm-hmm. One of the bedrooms.
Did you share with?
I shared with her. I shared the
mother?
bedroom with my mother. Mm-hmm. We had twin beds, and she brought everything down from upstairs, and I resented it. Oh, I resented not having my own room. But it couldn't be helped. And anyway, I was in college, or would be going to college shortly, so it really didn't make that much difference. Mm-hmm. But it was interesting to have all of those people, particularly the babies there, which I thoroughly enjoyed having them.
And you said that your mother worked.
Yes, she worked for the Line Oak Flooring Company.
Do you know what she did for them?
She was a credit manager for the Line Oak Flooring Company. And then when they went out of business, she went to work for West Lumber Company in the same capacity and worked for Mr. George West. Mm-hmm. So it was an interesting life.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, so tell me something sort of in general about your high school days. You said you walked to school.
I walked to school, and
Any favorite teachers?
Mrs. Wills, she was my Latin teacher, and Miss Flotting was my French teacher, and Mr. Clyde, what is his last name? Anyway, he was my history teacher, and he is the one who taught me to love history. And so when I went to LaGrange, I said I wanted to major in history, but I wound up getting 3 degrees from LaGrange because I had a triple major when I got out. My mother was of the old school. She said, idle hands to the devil's workshop. And so she made me go to Emory in the summertime between sessions at LaGrange. And that's how I wound up with 3 degrees. I wouldn't have had them if I would have had just 1 if it hadn't been for her making me go, riding the streetcar out to Emory every day.
Was college expensive? Your mother must have. She's been able to build a house. She must have had a pretty good.
She had a good income, but she was the sole support of my grandmother. Mm-hmm. And I was lucky enough and fortunate enough to receive a scholarship from LaGrange. My grades were such that I could, and as long as my grades remained at a B level in college, they would renew the scholarship. So it didn't cost her as much since I had that scholarship, but she stayed on me constantly to keep my grades up. And there was one time that they sent home a D in French, and she wrote back and she said, "This is not acceptable, and you will take French in summer." And that was all she said. She never blamed me, or she just said, "This is not acceptable." And I did. I went to Emory, and I took 3 classes of French, made A's in all of them, and was finished with my French requirement. So I was real happy because I didn't like that teacher. Mm-hmm. But it was interesting because during those days it was gas rationing, and if I came home, I had to come home on the bus from LaGrange, and there were soldiers all over the bus, and sometimes we would have a place to sit, and sometimes we would have to sit on our luggage or sit on one of the jump seats that they had. And
so was this coming home?
This was coming home from LaGrange because they were coming from Fort Benning in Columbus. And then coming towards Atlanta.
It would be on a bus.
Coming to Atlanta from LaGrange. No. The train schedule was much worse than it was using the bus, because the train schedule coming to Atlanta was not as frequent. I know that sounds peculiar, but it was more for moving freight than it was for travel. Mm-hmm. And so I used the bus. And sometimes when I would go back to school, Mother would come and pick me up.
So you had an automobile?
Yeah.
Had a car?
Had a Chevrolet.
A Chevrolet. What color was it?
It was green, the most horrible green I've ever seen in my life. But it was a good car, and that was when we had gas rationing. And I tried so hard to think. I know Mother didn't have the lowest letter for gas, and I'm not sure whether A was higher than C or what, but I know that they gave her one because she worked so far away from the home, and there was no public transportation to get her to the office, so she qualified for that. Mm-hmm. And she would save her coupons so that she could take me to college and then come back and pick me up when school was over. But rationing was something that was new.
What other things were rationed?
Candy, chocolate candy. Oh, good Lord. I like to have died because I'm a chocoholic. And
do you know how many people have told me the exact same?
Really? Oh, well, once
almost every woman who has come in has talked about, the candy was rationed.
Yeah, it was, and you couldn't have it. But Frances, once Benny had been in service for 6 months, got permission to go to the commissary at Fort Mac. And so she could buy 2 or 3 candy bars at a time. And she would bring them back to me, and she would say, "Now you better ration these because you're not going to have any more for 3 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever it was." But everything was rationed. I remember my grandmother planted a victory garden. One of the men who worked with my mother, a black man, came over and dug up a portion of our backyard. And my grandmother, having grown up on the farm in Atlanta, it was easy for her to grow things, and she grew beans and butter beans and squash and canned a great many of the things so that we could have them during the winter. And
Did you garden and can with your grandmother? Or?
I did the gardening. She wouldn't let me do any of the canning. I didn't have. She kept telling me, "You're not smart enough to do this," and I wasn't. I really didn't know what I was doing. But
did you enjoy the garden?
oh yes, I still garden. But I don't grow vegetables. I grow roses now and other flowers. But she taught me the love of working outside.
Do you remember the man's name that came to help?
No, I don't. I really don't.
That's all right.
But I remember he spaded the ground up and put everything in it that Mama would need.
So did he just come and start it off, or did he?
He started it off because after that, my grandmother would not allow anybody to touch the garden. I could go out and weed, but I better not touch anything else. And she was out there every day working in that garden. And it was good because we had food that we wouldn't have had otherwise. And my aunt, Evelyn, I'm trying to think, she started raising chickens on their place. They had about a 2-acre house on 2 acres, and they were able to raise chickens. This is in the Grove Park area. And she raised chickens, so we had more chicken than we did beef because beef was rationed. And you had so many coupons per month that you could use. And I remember Sister would always, we called Evelyn Sister, would always save a good fat pullet hen for me for my birthday because I like fried chicken and butter beans. And Mama would always get the butter beans out of the garden, and Sister would always have her husband to kill the chicken.
And as I recall, your birthday was in August?
In August.
Oh, perfect time.
Perfect timing.
Harvesting.
And we would have ice cream that you crank, not the electric freezer. And she would always make me a cake that she developed the recipe. And she told me when she gave me the recipe, because it is my favorite cake, if you give anybody that recipe, I will come back and haunt you after I die. So I have given it to no one. Now, my cousin will get it from me when I die. But she called it the Garden of Eden cake because it's got it's got a lot of spice and chocolate in it.
And chocolate.
Chocolate and spice.
Uh-huh.
But it was just interesting growing up in that neighborhood because you knew everybody. When I went to grammar school, I knew all the children that were there. When I went to high school, I knew all the children that were there. And
do you have any pictures of you working in the garden?
No, because we didn't take pictures then. The only time that I remember Mother taking pictures was on birthdays. She would take pictures on my birthday, my grandmother's birthday, and then her sister's birthday and her nephew's birthday.
Do you have a picture of you with a Garden of Eden cake?
No, I don't. I don't know where my mother moved in 1963 over to where I live now. And breaking down a large house like she had, she got rid of a lot of things that I wish she hadn't. She got rid of all of my Bobbsey twin books. She got rid of all my Nancy Drew books.
My mother, when I moved out and went to college, got rid of my Nancy Drew books.
And I think that's a crime.
I can't understand why she thought that they had to be gone.
I don't know either, but Mother got and I had a set of what were called a Child's World book that a friend of my mother's started me off when I was 3 years old. And she got rid of all those. And those things are priceless today. But she didn't have any room for them, is what she said. At least she didn't get rid of the china that my grandmother and she had. No, I don't have it. I gave it to my cousin's oldest daughter when she got married. But you wanted to know where I was when I heard about World War II and the bombing.
Pearl Harbor. When Pearl Harbor is bombed.
My mother had 7th, 1941.
Yes.
My mother had taken me and a friend to the Fox to see a movie. This was on Sunday. My grandmother did not approve, but movies were open, and Mother said there's no worse than her sitting here getting into trouble, which I was very good at doing.
So how old were you?
1941, I was 15.
15. Mm-hmm. So you were attending West Fulton?
A junior at West Fulton.
And it's Sunday morning and you go to the movie?
No, it's Sunday afternoon. Sunday afternoon we go to the movie. And Mother, when we came out, Mother said, do y'all want to go by the Yellow Jacket? that used to be something like the Varsity, and it was across from where the current Coca-Cola building is. And they had much better hot dogs than the Varsity did. They toasted their buns, and they put something on the bun, and it was just absolutely delicious.
Do you know what movie you saw?
No. I don't have any idea. But we were sitting there, and I asked Mother if I could turn the radio on, and she said yes. So she
in the car?
We were in the car.
So it's a drive-in.
It's a drive-in.
Yellow Jacket's a drive-in.
And she said yes and cranked the car up, because at that time you had to run the battery. And I was flipping the dials trying to find some music. And Mother said, leave that alone. That's the news. I want to hear what the weather's going to be. And suddenly, when we were sitting there, they were talking about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And Mother said, what? And my friend, I remember Mary asking, where's Pearl Harbor? Because you had heard of it, but we really didn't know exactly where it was. But then Mother said, hurry up and eat, I want to get home. And as soon as she got home, my grandmother said, Marjorie, do you know that they have bombed Pearl Harbor? And Mother said, yes, I want to hear the radio. And so she sat up. She made me go to bed, but she sat up a good while listening to the reports that were coming from Washington and from Pearl Harbor. And then the next day when we went to school, of course all of us knew what had happened by then, Mr. McElwain, who was our principal, came on the intercom and said, I want all of you to report to the auditorium. There will be a special assembly. And we thought, oh gosh, now what? And when we got in there, he told us that we were to sit very quietly because we were going to hear the president declare war or ask for a declaration of war. And everybody, you could hear a pin drop. It was so quiet. And I remember sitting there thinking, I don't think I'm hearing what I'm hearing. But I heard Roosevelt ask Congress to declare war against Japan and Germany. And it gave you a real weird feeling. And the whole day was just very somber. Very few people had anything to say. And the boys in our graduating class were 16, some of them were 17. Some of them lied about their age and joined the service. And one boy who had graduated the year ahead, 2 years ahead of me, was also a very good friend of our families. And he joined the Air Force and the Navy and trained in Pensacola and then went to San Diego, and from there went out to the Pacific. And he served in the Pacific only 6 months, and his plane was shot down, and they never knew what happened after that.
Do you remember his name?
Ray White. I
Ray
remember.
White.
I remember it very clearly. And he was the only child. That's what was so bad. And everyone who had members of the family in the services hung the stars in the window. They were usually blue stars. And then when someone was killed, it was always a gold star. And I remember going to the memorial service at our church for Ray, and Mrs. White saying to my grandmother as we were walking out, I'll never see him again. And that was sad because it was her only child. She didn't have any more. And in her window was that gold star, and it hung there until I don't remember when she took it down. It was there even after the war was over. But that was the first really casualty that I knew anything about. Later on, there were other people that I knew that either lost friends or family members in the war.
If your uncle was in the service, did you have a star?
Yes, my aunt did. My aunt did. She got one and put it in the front window in the living room. And it stayed there until he came home. And then she took it down.
Were there many stars up and down?
Oh, yes, everywhere. Everywhere you would go, there were stars. Because there were so many young men. In our graduating class, there were 2 boys who were my age, 16, when we graduated, and they lied about their age and said they were 18 and joined the Army. And
Their names?
one of them was J.B. Elliott, and the other one, gosh, I don't remember what the other's name was.
That's all right.
But they came home with no problems, and they managed to escape any serious injury. And but it just surprised me that that the Army would take them, but they needed men so desperately that they weren't bothering to check on the ages. And J.B. lied like a trooper when he said he was 18. He was no more 18 than I was. But it was a very, I won't say hard time, but you always, in the back of your mind, you were always wondering what was going to happen. We had air raid wardens on the streets for fear that we would be bombed. I remember my grandmother getting some black cloth and making blackout curtains, which we never used. They stayed in her room in the closet the whole time. But it was just that you felt like you needed to be prepared because you really weren't sure of what was going to happen.
You talked about growing up in Grove Park and at night sitting on the curbs. What about during the war?
Not during the war. Not during the war.
So what were evenings like?
Usually you spent the time reading or visiting with people. Young like I was, we would go to the school where they had dances, and yet you loved it and you enjoyed it and you had a good time, but you never could escape the war. It was always with you because you knew that some of the people that you were seeing would be leaving shortly to go to the war. And yet we carried on as normal of activities as we possibly could. I still went to movies. I still went shopping. Couldn't buy anything because there was nothing to buy. I remember taking makeup and putting it on my legs, and then my aunt drawing the line up the back of my legs to make it look like hose because silk stockings were all we wore. We didn't have nylons. And there were, you just didn't have anything like that. We were rationed on shoes. And when I went to college, Mother bought me 2 pair, one for everyday and one for dress. And she said, now these have got to last you for 4 years, so you take care of them. They didn't last me for 4 years. I had to get some new everyday shoes. But the dress shoes did last for 4 years.
What did the shoes look like?
The loafers that I wear today are similar to the loafers that I wore then. And
penny loafers?
Penny loafers, and saddle Oxfords. We wore saddle Oxfords. That was the second pair of everyday shoes that I bought. I wanted a pair of saddle Oxfords. And the dress shoes were just, plain shoes, but they had much higher heels than I wear today. And
dark, sensible shoes?
No. I think mine were navy. That is dark, but it was not sensible because I'm trying to think. I think it had a bow on it. I don't really remember. Gosh, I haven't thought about that in years. But the clothing, my mother made a lot of my clothing, and she and my grandmother together, because clothing was so scarce and so expensive that what you could find.
What was your favorite thing that you wore?
Skirts. They made me, they were supposed to be wool, but they really weren't. I don't remember what Mother called them, but skirts to wear to school, because when I was in college, you did not wear pants. You wore skirts and blouses. And so Mother would always make me at least 2 skirts before I went to college and buy me a couple of blouses if she could find them. And then I would have to wear the clothes that I'd had the year or 2 years before
Any
that.
Sweaters, if they were sewing, were they knitting?
No, nobody in my family knitted. I tried to learn, but I never could. I'm trying to remember. I think my aunt and I shared sweaters because, again, they were scarce. The wool was going to the service. And I think she and I swapped sweaters back and forth when I came home at Christmas time so that I would have a new sweater to take back to school. And at college, the one thing that sticks out in my mind about World War II, we had to take our ration books because everybody had ration books for food. And we had to take ours down there when we went because they needed it to get food to feed us. Every Sunday for dinner, for lunch, they would serve us Spam. And to this day, I cannot look Spam in the face. I hate, if I see it on the shelf in the grocery store, I'll turn my head. I just can't stand the sight of it. And Miss Murphy had a hard time getting food and making ends meet to feed all of us. And milk, she would get the powdered milk. I don't like milk to this day because of that. And it was very hard for her to cope. And my grandmother would try to send care packages about once a month to me. And everybody in the dormitory would get packages from home. And my roommate's father owned a grocery store. And Jane Ellen would ride the bus to Noonan about once every 2 weeks, and she would go in her father's grocery store, and we would give her money and say, get whatever you can, and she would come back with things that we could eat. But we had hot plates and coffee pots in our room illegally, and we did a lot of cooking on those hot plates because the food in the cafeteria was awful, just awful. And we could walk from the campus to town because the campus is a little bit out from town, and we would always go to the Tasty Diner because that was the one place we could get a grilled cheese sandwich. But college was it was interesting because the Fort Benning officers had asked that some of the girls from college be allowed to come to the USO down in Columbus, and our president of college would not allow that. He said, if you want them to be with the girls and to dance with the girls, you can bring them here, but I will not allow them to go there. And we thought it was horrible, but I see his point because he was responsible for all of us. And it was a all-female school. It's not anymore. And so it was very difficult. And there were no boys to date because all the boys that were our age in LaGrange had gone into the service. So if you wanted to date somebody, you had to know somebody in the service that could bring somebody to introduce you. And the young man that he and I were sweethearts from the time we were in the 6th grade in grammar school, joined the service. Oh, I guess Bayard joined I think he completed 3 years at Emory and then joined the service.
His name?
Bayard Hudgens. He's a doctor here in Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And we were childhood sweethearts, and everybody thought we would get married, and we had no intention of marrying either one of them. But he came back and under the GI Bill finished his med school. But it was really interesting to see the difference when people would come back that you knew what they did. My uncle wanted to go to college, but with 2 children, he didn't have an opportunity to do that, so he went to night school and then went to work for the post office and worked with them until he retired 30 years ago.
I'm sorry, I forgot the fellow's name you said. Was it Emory for 3 years?
Bayard Hudgens.
Bayard. Mm-hmm. Did you correspond with Bayard?
No, we didn't. We didn't really correspond with anybody because when you're in college, you don't have that much money, or at least we didn't then. And one of the things that we had to be very careful was that Mother would send me an allowance once a month, and that allowance had to last me for the whole month, which meant that I couldn't just go out and spend frivolously on things. I had to count. I had to count my pennies. Mm-hmm. And the other thing was that we didn't get Coca-Colas that often, and that's my downfall. That and chocolate. But it really was. I don't think it was hard growing up during the war. Mm-hmm. Maybe I was so dumb and stupid I didn't realize what I was missing. But I really didn't. We were never deprived of anything. We had to watch what we used. In high school, they would tell us when we would buy our lunch, use your money and buy stamps with saving stamps. And they gave us all a saving stamps book, and we would take our money and buy saving stamps with them and then turn it in when we had enough to get a savings bond, or war bond as they were called. And we also saved tin foil off of the chewing gum wrappers. And that was our way of helping to contribute to the war effort. My grandmother saved...
What kind of chewing gum?
Beech nut.
Beech nut?
Uh-huh. And my grandmother saved grease. Now, don't ask me why. I have absolutely no idea why she saved grease. But she had containers, and my mother would take it somewhere. I don't know where she took it. But anything my grandmother fried, she would pour the grease into this container. And when it became full, Mother would take it wherever it was she was supposed to take it. But that was one thing that was the war effort. And it was just, it wasn't a bad time growing up.
Some other big events, D-Day. Where were
I
you?
had just come home from college, and I was tired and I was sleeping late because I didn't have to start Emory until the next week, and I just wanted to rest. And my grandmother came. She never knocked on the door. She always opened the door. And she knocked on the door of the bedroom where my mother and I slept. Mother had already gone to work. And she said, get up right now. And I said, I'm sleeping, Mama. She repeated it, get up and get up now. And with that, I was lying on my side. She popped me on my rear end. And I got up, and she said, come in here, right now, come in here. And she was listening to Wright Bryan broadcast the landing on Normandy. He was a very prominent newsman here at that time, and he had been given permission to watch the landing at Normandy. And that was the first I knew anything about it. And then after that, we followed it every day, what was going on in Normandy, and particularly in the South Pacific, where so many of my friends' sons and friends of theirs were in service. Mm-hmm. But yes, I remember that very vividly because my grandmother woke me up.
And what about VJ Day?
I don't remember that much about...
Or the bombs being dropped.
I remember more about the bombs being dropped than I do about VJ Day. I had come home from college, and a very good friend of my mother's son was home from service, and he was marrying his sweetheart. And we were getting dressed to go to the wedding, and Mother had the radio on, and they announced that they had dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. And I said, Mother, what's an A-bomb or an atom bomb? She said, I have no earthly idea, but if it brings a war to a close, that's all well and good. And so I really didn't know what an atom bomb was until they began to publish all the information 4 or 5 months later, what the atom bomb was and what the destructive use of it was. But VE Day, I don't remember where I was, and neither do I remember where I was on VJ Day, but I can tell you specifically where I was when we heard about Roosevelt's death.
That was my next question.
One of my majors was speech and drama, and the radio...
Warm Springs
is not that far from LaGrange. And every afternoon we would do a program on the little radio station at LaGrange. And that afternoon it happened to be my time to go down with several of my friends, and we were doing a radio program. Well, when we came into the station, Mr. Mullinax said, the president is dead. And we said, well, we're not going to do the program. He said, oh, yes, you are. And we said, oh, no, we can't. And he said, you will do the program, because they were trying to get all the information about what was happening and what was going to be taking place. And then when we found out when the train was coming through LaGrange, because it did come through LaGrange to Atlanta, we all were dismissed from class to go down to the train station and watch the funeral train go through.
And what was that like? What did you see?
The car with the casket draped with a flag. We didn't see any of the family. I remember seeing pictures later of Graham Jackson playing Going Home, but I don't remember other than seeing the train.
Was that in it?
That was in Atlanta. Yeah, he was in Atlanta, but he was the favorite musician of Roosevelt. And I remember him playing the accordion, seeing pictures of him, and tears just streaming down his face. But it was a very solemn moment. The train went slow. It didn't just go through quickly. It went slow because there were so many people who had gathered.
It never stopped.
It never stopped. It just passed. And I don't think it stopped until it got to Washington. I don't know that for a fact, but I don't think it did. But everybody gathered, and my mother went down to the old terminal station, and she and my grandmother saw the funeral train go through.
Through in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm. They were not as close as we were because LaGrange wasn't that large, and we were able to, we were able to be as close as they would allow us to get to the train tracks. Mm-hmm. But I remember that very vividly. My roommate, Jane Ellen, 2 friends, Mary Alice and Wren, and some other friends from college. We walked from the college to the train station, which today people would say, oh my, that's so far. It wasn't that far. Maybe a half a mile or a mile.
You got there.
We got there. That was all that was important. But
And then when the train actually passed,
then
was there a conversation? Was it silent?
No, it was just silence. And we all turned around and started walking back to school, and we didn't have too much to say. And I think most of us subconsciously wondered what was going to happen now, because Roosevelt was the only president we'd ever known. And I remember Mr. Quillian calling me in.
Who's Mr. Quillian?
He was the president of LaGrange while I was there. Dr. Quillian, Lord knows if he'd come out of the grave and shoot me for that, asking me if I was 18. And I said, no, sir, I'm only 17. And he said, because at that time Georgia had given the 18-year-old the right to vote. And he said, well, I was hoping you were 18 because I wanted you to represent the college at a debate for the presidency. And I said, no, sir, I'm only 17. So he declined the invitation for anybody from the college to be on the debate. But it was just, I guess after the war was over in 45, we were a little freer. We felt less restricted. We felt that we were able to move around and do things more freely than we had during the war. We had chocolate.
And Coca-Cola.
And Coca-Cola. Oh Lord, that was the best time of my life. And it was just a different atmosphere. And when we graduated, there were only 18 in our graduating class. We all went to different areas. I came back to Atlanta, went to work for Shell Oil Company, worked for them for 5 years, and then married and moved out of the state for, how long? For 10 years, and then came back after my husband died.
Tell me your husband's name.
John McKibben.
And you all were married when?
In 1953.
How did you meet him?
He worked for the same oil company that I did. He worked for Shell Oil. He was a salesman, and I was a secretary. And they had bowling teams, and I met him there. And then after we were married, we lived in Tampa in South Carolina.
Were you married here in Atlanta?
Yes, married at our family church at Bethany. And it was a sad occasion because the uncle that I was supposed to give me away had a hunting accident the week before the wedding and was unable to participate. So my younger uncle had to give me away. But I'm sorry that Ford couldn't be there for the wedding. But he was not seriously injured, but he was serious enough to be in the hospital for almost a month. So because the gunshot hit his leg somehow, other than they weren't sure they could save it. But it was just wonderful growing up in Atlanta. Even with the war, I still went to movies. I still bought records when I could save my money. And these were old.
Rainy Tunes?
Oh, yes. String of Pearls was my favorite. And In the Mood, Chattanooga Choo Choo. What else?
And you would buy records and you had a phonograph?
I had a phonograph. And
these were the...
These were the large records, which I still have. I still have a lot of the 78 records. And but you couldn't buy them. I mean, there weren't that many available until after the war because there was something in them that they used. And but I never felt deprived. Never in my life did I feel deprived. And I think the happiest time was, even though I hated it when Mother told me I had to do it, was to go out to Emory every summer and I went 3 summers and took classes out there, and I dearly loved it. And that's why I went back to Emory to get my graduate degrees. And it's Emory. I said something when Gertrude, a friend of mine who graduated with me from LaGrange, and I went back for our 55th anniversary 2 years ago.
What's Gertrude's last name?
McFarland. She's from Dalton. Has been a very good friend ever since college. And I said something about, I really must remember to write my check to the alumni fund at Emory this month because what I had pledged was due. And she looked at me and she said, "What do you give to LaGrange?" And I said, well, let's change the subject. And I really shouldn't, but I just had such a wonderful time at Emory. because while we had good teachers at LaGrange, and I won't downplay that at all, it was just a very small school, and you just didn't have the access to...
Well, 18 in your graduating
Yeah,
class.
and you just didn't...
No boys.
No boys. And you didn't have any access to... Well, it used to be called Candler Library at the end of the quadrangle at Emory. And I know the first time I went in there in the summertime, I was astounded. We had books, yes, but that was 4 floors of wall-to-wall, ceiling-to-floor books. And yes, a lot of them were old books. But I had never seen that before. And that's why when I got ready to do my graduate work, I went back to Emory.
When did you do this graduate work?
I got my first degree in '76 and my second degree in '78.
What were the degrees?
One was my master's in history, and then I got what is called the Diploma for Advanced Standing. I got it right. The one step below the PhD. And I got that in history also. But I wanted to get my PhD, but at that time Emory required that you take a full year and be on campus doing the work. They don't require that anymore. And my mother had died, and I didn't have the money to take a full year off from work. So I just had to pass up the PhD. It hadn't hurt me.
So this, you married, moved to Tampa, you said?
Mm-hmm. And then from Tampa to South Carolina. My husband died in South Carolina.
What year?
In 1963, and I moved back to Atlanta in 1966.
And got the 2 degrees from Emory.
Mm-hmm.
And then what did you do with the degrees?
I taught school for 32 and a half years.
Which school?
I was in the Fulton County school system. I taught first at Old Sandy Springs High School. It used to be called Sandy Springs, well, it still is called Sandy Springs Circle, but it's where the Kroger store is today. And then Ridgeview opened, and I went to Ridgeview High School, stayed there 15 years. And then from there I went to Roswell for 2 years, because the principal that I'd worked with at Ridgeview wanted me to come up there and work with him, and I had full intentions of staying for the rest of my career, but unfortunately, no, I shouldn't say that. I was transferred downtown to be a coordinator of special programs. So I stayed down there and retired January 2nd, 1992. How the 32 and a half years came in, I taught school 3 years in Florida and 3 years in South Carolina. And so I had 6 years out of state. Mm-hmm. Taught history. American, European, Russian, Chinese, Middle East history.
And you're still teaching today?
Doing volunteer teaching. Mm-hmm. Teach senior adults.
What are you teaching them right now?
Eleanor Roosevelt, the early years. And then the next quarter will be the years in the White House. And then the third quarter will be the years after Roosevelt's death and what she did then. Mm-hmm. And I love to read. Except I told my dog last night when I was preparing for
the dog.
My dog.
Okay.
Because I don't have anybody home except my dog.
Uh-huh.
I said, I'm tired of studying. I had just finished going over my notes for the 4th time for today. And I said, I'm tired of this, Blackie. Believe me, starting tomorrow night, I'm not going to do anything but read trash. And because you get, and he looked up at me as if to say, I don't care what you read. But you get tired. I like to study, don't misunderstand me. I dearly love to study. But there is a saturation point. Mm-hmm. And I have reached that saturation point. Mm-hmm. So this weekend and all next week, because my lesson is prepared for next Thursday, I'm going to read what I want to read.
That sounds great. You made some notes.
Yes.
Have you told me everything that's on the piece of paper? Is there anything you missed?
Let's see, Mama's bus trip. I did forget. We did have a celebration in May when they declared the war was over in Europe. Mm-hmm. They gave us the day off from classes, and they told us to...
Was it high school or college?
College. It was, LaGrange is a Methodist school, and they told us to go to the chapel and pray. Well...
On your day off?
Mm-hmm. Some of us did. Most of us went to the tennis court.
Where did you go?
I'm not going to answer that question.
You said most of us went to the tennis courts. I'm going to guess.
You can guess where I went. One other thing. My mother and grandmother were asked by our church on numerous occasions to entertain servicemen who were at Lawson Field and at Fort Mac and at the Naval Air Station, and I'm trying to remember, there were 4 of them. I don't remember what the other one was. In their homes, they would bring them to church, and then Mother and Mama would bring them home for lunch, or what they call dinner, and they would give them an opportunity to be in a home. And sometimes I was home, and sometimes I wasn't. But Mother always invited my aunts over, and their husband, Biddy wasn't home. Francis would always come down from upstairs, and Sister and Ford would always come over. So it would give the servicemen a feeling of being at home.
Was it a different serviceman?
Yes, there were always 2. There were always 2 servicemen, always 2.
Never the same.
Never the same ones. And I think Mother and Mama had them probably every other week. Again, food was scarce, and most servicemen liked beef. Well, beef was very scarce because you had to give those coupons in.
What did you have for dinner?
Mostly chicken and dressing. And if my grandmother, if it was in the time that she was using the garden, green beans, squash, whatever. If it wasn't and she had canned it, then she would take the cans and use that. And cornbread. Most of them came from other parts of the country. They didn't know what cornbread was. But some of them would eat it, and then she learned to make cornbread and biscuits. And they usually ate the biscuits and not the cornbread.
And who would do the cooking?
My grandmother. We had a lady who worked for us, Susie. She worked for us, from the time I was about 10 till till my grandmother died.
African-American? Susie?
And Susie.
Do you remember her last name?
Oh.
That's all right.
I don't remember.
That's all right.
I do remember.
Did she stay with you once the war started?
Well, yes, she was with us until my grandmother died in 1980. She was very young when she came to work for us. And when Susie died, Hurd, that's the name, Susie Hurd. When she died, her daughter called and asked my mother to come and do the eulogy because Susie had been with our family for so long. And one of the funny stories I remember Mother telling, she would get so put out with Susie because Susie liked to play the bug. That was our form of lottery with the numbers in the paper. Well, that was all right if she played it. Mother didn't like it, but she wouldn't say anything. But then Susie started writing it, and she got arrested, I think 4 times. And the 4th time Mother told her, you get arrested, you're going to stay in jail. I'm not going to come down and bail you out anymore. But it was that kind of relationship. We had she went to my wedding, sat with the family. She went to my grandmother's funeral, sat with the family. She was at all the christenings and weddings in the family. She was part of our family.
Was she married?
She had been married, but her husband, I don't know what happened. I don't know whether he just walked out or whether he died.
You mentioned a daughter. Did she have any other children?
She had a son who had left Atlanta when he was in his teens and gone to Detroit. And he came back once, and that was when his mother got sick and then for the funeral. But Louise, the daughter, was always very close to her mother and took good care of her. And Mother, when Susie couldn't work anymore, Mother gave her a little pension. It wasn't much, but it was enough to help out because she didn't have any other income at that time. But the funniest thing that happened, I can't stand starch in my blouses till this day. And at that time I was wearing dresses, and I picked up one and it had so much starch in it, and I just rolled it up and threw it back in the dirty clothes bag. And when I got home that afternoon from school, that dress was out of the dirty clothes bag, spread very neatly, wrinkles and all, on my bed. And I went storming down the steps to my grandmother, and she said, if you ever do that again, young lady, you will wash and iron your own clothes. And I said, "Did Susie do that?" She said, "It doesn't matter who did it. Did you hear what I say?" So I never did that again. And Susie kept putting the starch in it, and it would rub my neck and under my arms, and I would just be infuriated. But I knew better than to throw that in the dirty clothes anymore. I was taught very quickly. And something about her relationship with my family, when Carlton and Michael were little, and she helped to look after them, and of course I was a little older than that, we were told to say yes ma'am and no ma'am to her. And I remember so well Carlton sassed her one morning when he was eating breakfast. He wanted something and she didn't get it for him, and he got very smart with her. And my grandmother, I can see it till this day, jerked him up from the table by the arm, took him in the bathroom, and spanked him good. And when he came back in, he said, "I'm sorry, Susie. I didn't mean to be ugly." And we knew that if we were ugly to her or talked back to her, we'd get punished. And that's most unusual. You don't find that. It has to be a very strong relationship for that to occur. Mm-hmm. We had streetcars. We rode streetcars all over the place. We didn't have trolleys then. And that was when they would go to the end of the line and get off and switch the whatever that thing was that ran on the wires. I guess that's all. I can't think of anything else. I've covered everything, it looks like. But I don't regret growing up in Atlanta. I just wish it would go back to the way it was. Atlanta's not Atlanta anymore. It's a metropolitan city, and I don't like it. A friend of mine lived here for 30 years, and when she retired 2 years ago, she moved to St. Augustine. And I thought she would be miserable, but she said it was the best move that she ever made. But she doesn't have any family here. I couldn't do that because all of my family are here.
Your roots are very
My
deep.
roots are very deep.
Very deep.
Very deep. And
you're still in the house now?
that my mother bought when she sold the old house.
Uh-huh.
In fact, I asked my cousin, I have two cousins that are one directly related to me and the other one is a distant cousin, who are very interested in genealogy. And we have been trying, in fact, I've got to come down here to your library to see if I can find some information. But we want to go back to Hollywood Cemetery and see if we can find Papa's people. And we also want to go over to the old Coursey Cemetery where my grandmother's 3 babies are buried, and my great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather are buried there. But the last time I was out in Grove Park, and it's not an area that you want to go into now unless you know where you're going and you have someone with you other than just a woman should never go out there. But my cousin and I went out to put some flowers on our grandmother's grave for Christmas, and we rode by the old houses where he lived and where I lived, and they are very well kept. I was very pleased, and I know Mother would have been pleased. The only reason she left Grove Park was because the blacks moved in, and it just wasn't safe for her to live there by herself. My mother wanted so badly to build a house on Mount Perrin when she built the house on Elizabeth Place, but my grandmother wouldn't move. She said, "This is my home. This is where I grew up. This is where I married. This is where I had my children. This is where I'm going to die." And she did. And then she died in 1960, and Mother stayed there until 1963, and then she moved. But
when did your mother die, did you tell me?
1974. Doesn't seem like it's been 30 years, but almost 30 years, but it has. And it was just a wonderful community to grow up in. Everybody was so good and so kind, and it was just, you don't have that kind of community anymore. If you know your next door neighbor, you're lucky. Most of the time you don't know anybody. I'm lucky I do know my next door neighbors. But
Been there a long time.
I've been there since '66, so I know them. But the house right next to me has been sold twice, so there's been a change there, but it's just, Atlanta's so different. I remember going to see Gone with the Wind at the Lowe's Grand.
Were you at the premiere?
No.
Oh.
We sat on the curb for the premiere in front of the Carnegie Library. Mother took me and 3 of my friends down, and we sat on the curb and we saw Clark Gable and Carole Lombard, Claudette Colbert. I don't think we saw Vivian Leigh. We saw Leslie Howard came. And it was just a very exciting time for us to be growing up in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember when the Winecoff?
Oh yes, I was coming home from college for the weekend, and Mother met me at the bus station, and she said the Winecoff is on fire, so we're going to have to go around a different way. And I said, what do you mean the Winecoff is on fire? And she said, it started last night and people have died in the Winecoff. We didn't know how many people or how badly it was until the paper came out the next day. And then we saw the pictures of the people jumping out of the windows. And that was the most horrible. I mean, it was just something you don't ever think will happen, and when it does, you don't want it to ever happen again. It was just too horrible to even think about. But yes, I remember that very well.
Other Atlanta events, and we've only got maybe 5 more minutes. When Martin Luther King was assassinated and his funeral, do you remember?
I didn't.
Atlanta?
I was in Atlanta at that time. I did not go to the funeral because it was just, I'll be honest with you, I didn't know whether it was safe or not for a white person to be there. But oh yes, I remember that very well, and watching it on television as they did the funeral procession.
Or the airplane crash?
Oh, I was living in South Carolina at that time, and we had gone to the beach, and my husband came in with a newspaper, and he said, "Did you know that a plane had crashed in France that carried a lot of Atlanta art patrons?" I said, "No," and he handed me the paper, and I recognized a lot of the names that I had known. And yes, I remember that very well, and thinking, oh my goodness, how horrible.
Do you remember the temple bombing?
Yes, that was the most awful thing in the world. That should never have occurred. But you have to understand, at that time, Atlanta was divided into sections. Jews lived in one section, Catholics lived in the other, and then Protestants lived in another section. And I just remember, why? And I remember asking Mother, why? What's wrong? I had Jewish friends. I grew up with Jewish friends. And they were just people like me. I didn't understand why they had to do that. But yes, I remember that very well. I remember also when we had 3 governors. Worst day of my life when we had 3 governors.
History teachers should remember.
I remember all that. But Atlanta has a rich history, and I don't think a lot of people who've moved into Atlanta realize the history that we do have, because so much of it has been destroyed. They've torn these beautiful homes down and put up these sterile buildings. But Atlanta has a tremendous history. And I remember saying to my uncle, you remember when the terminal station was there? Of course, that's where he went out of and came back in. And he said, yes, and the Union Station. And I said, yes, and Lowe's Grand, and the Paramount, and the Roxy, and the Capitol, and all of those theaters. And it's gone. It's ridiculous that you tear down something that has history in the name of progress, because progress isn't that important.
We did save the Fox.
Yeah, that's the only one that was saved. And even the Rialto, luckily now Georgia State has it, but even the Rialto was allowed to just disintegrate until Georgia State took it over. But Atlanta was good. It was a good place. I used to get on the streetcar and go all over Atlanta and never had a fear in my life. I wouldn't even dream of, if streetcars were around, doing that today, because Atlanta is literally a metropolitan city. At that time, I was home from college for Christmas. My mother had told me to meet her downtown at the old S&W Cafe, We would have lunch. She would
On
give
Peachtree.
on Peachtree. She would give me the money that I could go Christmas shopping for my family, and I was to meet her there promptly at 11:45. Not 1 minute before, not 1 minute after. Well, I sort of just took my time and didn't make it 11:45. My mother wasn't there. I had spent the last 10 cents on the car fare coming into Atlanta, and I absolutely panicked because I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't have any money to call, and so I remembered my aunt was working that day at the old Atlanta Title Trust Company, and I walked down there and I said, "Frances, where's my mother?" And she said, "I know exactly where she is. She's back at the office where she's supposed to be. You didn't meet her when she told you to." And I said, "Well, will you give me a dime to get home?" "After you call your mother, I will." And Mother just gave me fits. And that taught me that when she said to be somewhere, I was on time after that. But that was the most frightening experience I ever had, to be stranded downtown and thinking I was going to have to walk all the way from downtown home. And it was a horrible experience. As I said, I wish Atlanta would go back like it was. It was just, everybody knew everybody. Everybody took care of everybody. And now they don't care. They really don't. And it's just too big. It's just way too big. And one other thing, and then I'll shut up. When I was a senior in high school, 5 of us decided we were going to skip class the last week of school. We were seniors. We felt like we had privilege to do what we wanted to. So we went to homeroom and answered the roll call, and then we left. And we were going downtown just to look around and have lunch and maybe take in a movie, but always be home by the time school was out. And when I got home, my grandmother was standing on the front stoop, and she had her arms crossed like this. And she said, "How was school today?" "Fine. We had a good time." "You did? Go call your mother." And so I called Mother, and she said, "How was school?" And we went through this routine. She said, "I understand you went downtown." I said, "How did you know?" 5 of my mother's friends saw me downtown, and they called her and told her. And this was the week, before we were to graduate on Sunday, have a baccalaureate on Sunday and graduate on Monday. I could go to baccalaureate and I could go to graduation. I was not allowed to go to any of the graduation parties. That was my punishment. And Mother said, the next time you do something like that, you'll be punished even more severely. So, believe me, that stuck in my mind. Ooh, I never did anything else that was bad. I didn't talk about World War II. I just talked about Atlanta.
You did. That was wonderful. All right. Is there anything else, or is that?
No, that's it.
That's it?
Mm-hmm.
Frances, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for